Hi, my name is Crystal, and we're going to talk about domestic violence, a social issue. When little girls are young, they often fantasize about falling in love, getting married, and living happily ever after. It's every little girl's dream. But what happens when the person she falls in love with becomes a violent partner? Well, let's first understand what domestic violence is, and then we're going to provide a brief history of domestic violence, and then we're going to learn about domestic violence and how it impacts not only society, but the children that are being raised in domestic violence situations. This presentation will discuss how persuasion can inspire action. Lastly, this presentation will provide strategies for intervention, prevention, and how a victim can leave a toxic relationship that has turned into a domestic violence situation. So how can persuasion help those in domestic violent relationships? Well, we'll talk about that in just a minute. But first, let's go back to the beginning, when the relationship was good and there was no domestic violence. It probably started off as what we call a toxic relationship. So what does a toxic relationship look like? Well, there could be excessive jealousy or fits of rage. Maybe they bring out the worst in you, or it's all about them. Maybe there's some belittling, intimidation, lack of trust. Maybe they're disrespectful, or maybe they're just not supportive. Maybe they're all take and no give. Are you always walking on eggshells? Is your relationship draining and depressing? If you answered yes to any one of these, you could be in a toxic relationship. A domestic violent relationship is when the toxic traits start to form a pattern. It is my theory that at the root of every domestic violent relationship is insecurity. So the behavior that they exhibit when they're insecure is really they try to control everything. So if insecurity leads to control tactics, what can we do about it? Well, let's first make sure we understand what domestic violence is. Domestic violence can be any of the following. It can be physical, emotional, financial, sexual, or psychological abuse. Let's talk about emotional abuse for a second. I think the bridge between emotional abuse and physical abuse is intimidation. Because when a partner uses his or her anger or they threat violence to control another person, that's intimidation. That's crossing the line between just trying to hurt somebody emotionally to possibly hurting them physically. Other forms of emotional abuse is humiliation, harassment, embarrassment, social isolation, verbal assaults, insults, threats, financial control, work restrictions, and disregard for the victim's needs. So which is worse? Well, while physical abuse can leave evidence of domestic violence, such as bruises and swelling, emotional abuse, such as intimidation, can be even more damaging. But like I said, domestic violence is not just a one-time thing. It's a pattern. That means it comes and goes and comes again. It's a cycle that never stops. Let's take this cycle of domestic violence, for example. Most relationships start off in a honeymoon phase, where you're in love and everything is wonderful and you don't see anything wrong with them. Or if you do, it's not that big of a deal. You guys can get through anything. The relationship is wonderful and hopeful and you see so many possibilities in your future. But then the facade starts to fade and tensions start to increase. You're walking on eggshells. You're not sure what's going to set him off. He might stand over you, try to control your every move. And then bam, explosion. Oh, but he didn't really mean to explode. Or it's not that big of a deal that he exploded. Or it's your fault that he exploded. There's justification and minimalization. It's just really confusing for everybody involved. It's like putting a Band-Aid over it. There might be empty promises that he'll never do it again and that he's really sorry. Or maybe he just pretends like it didn't happen. Eventually, it'll go back into honeymoon phase. And then the tensions increase, and then he tries to control you again, and then bam, explosion again. This could be him yelling and screaming or throwing things or hitting you. But it always comes back around to justification and minimalization, putting the Band-Aid on it. Promising he'll never do it again, or just pretending like it didn't happen, and then back to the honeymoon phase. It's a never-ending cycle. Another term for domestic violence is intimate partner violence, or IPV for short. Intimate partner violence is one of the most common forms of violence against women and includes physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. She might even experience controlling behaviors by her intimate partner. So you might ask yourself, why hasn't she left him yet? Often it's because most women who find themselves in an abusive relationship cycle are unable to find the support or resources to leave. Other reasons why she hasn't left yet is because she's lonely and she's afraid she's going to be alone forever. Or maybe her empathy makes her feel responsible for his pain. Maybe she doesn't want to lose all those years she's invested into the relationship. Many times, women who will find themselves in an intimate partner violent relationship have romanticized the relationship, and they fantasize about growing old together or making the marriage work or sticking it through thick and thin. Speaking of fantasizing, she sees the potential in him versus the actual reality. And what's the saddest of all is she doesn't believe she can do any better. He has made her feel so low about herself that she thinks this is as good as it's ever going to get. So if you know anybody that's in a domestic violent relationship, don't hound them about leaving, because if it were easy to leave, poof, they'd be gone. It would actually be more beneficial to educate and spread awareness of what red flags of domestic violence are. Let's go over a few examples of what red flags of domestic violence can look like. As I was stating earlier, I believe the first red flag for spotting a relationship heading towards domestic violence is insecurity. This means that insecurity will be the lens that this guy will see everything through. But did you know that there's yellow flags, orange flags, and red flags? That's right. Yellow flags is when she chooses to make other plans, but he responds negatively. Even though it's subtle, he's conditioning her to believe that spending all of her time with him is her idea. This is just the start of the isolation process. If she's not aware of the yellow flags turning into red flags eventually, then she might not call off the relationship at this point, and as it progresses, those yellow flags will turn into orange flags. This means that once she's isolated, he starts to test her boundaries, and he starts making even more demands on her resources and her time. If she falls short of his expectations, she will hear about it from him. To avoid this, she does whatever she can to please him. Someone who is unaware of the red flags of a toxic relationship might not spot these toxic traits yet. That's when the orange flags will eventually turn to red flags. So now that she's codependent to him, he will use intimidation to control her. He might also belittle her, yell, call her names, even hit her. She'll do anything to prevent his outbursts. She'll even start to believe that somehow his behavior is her fault. So while I believe that insecurity is the root of all domestic violence, having a partner with insecurity doesn't necessarily mean they'll have tendencies for abuse. Comorbidity of domestic abuses just simply means that different types of violence can often coexist. Physical IPV is often accompanied by sexual IPV and is usually accompanied by emotional abuse. Here's an example. A woman who is told by her husband that she is not capable of surviving without him will eventually believe him. This is because she's been conditioned to be fully dependent on him, and most likely she's consumed with self-doubt. Therefore, she is being both psychologically abused and possibly financially abused if she isn't allowed to have a job or obtain her own financial resources. Her partner might even use intimidation or threats to physically hurt her if she tries to leave. This would mean she is also being emotionally abused and possibly being physically abused too. And the thing that makes her stay is that she thinks it's her fault. She might say things like, "I am such a terrible wife, I need to try harder." No, sweetie, you just need to get out. Did you know in some cultures it was considered acceptable for a husband to discipline his wife physically? However, women's rights movements helped bring several things into light in the 20th century. More women found their voice to speak up against the domestic violence. Slowly, now that laws have begun to change, resources are available to support victims. However, emotional abuse like control and intimidation is much less visible and often goes unnoticed and unaddressed. Therefore, speaking up doesn't always help. Sadly, domestic violence has often been associated with a just world hypothesis. For example, if a woman was raped, the common social belief was that the woman must have been responsible for the rape somehow. Ridiculous. One of the biggest impacts that society has had to change domestic violence was the #MeToo movement. So I guess society is getting better, or at least I thought it was. Movements like #MeToo have shined a spotlight on the problem and pushed for greater support for victims. Yet this movement against domestic violence didn't take into consideration that society already has a bias against men. Men who claim that they are abused usually are disbelieved because the typical victim of domestic violence is often female. Unless you were living under a rock, then you must have heard about the Johnny Depp and Amber Heard trial. Who won this trial anyway? Well, Depp was often seen as the winner in his defamation case against Heard, even though they were both found liable. Why would anyone care? Well, the trial was both intriguing and disgusting, but most of all educational. Many were able to learn about the social psychology of the two Hollywood stars amongst a sea full of supporters for either party. But in the end, both of them had to pay out money. Speaking of money and additional risks, domestic violence can lead to significant costs in healthcare, productivity losses, legal services, and social support systems. For instance, the CDC, Centers of Disease Control and Prevention, estimates that intimate partner violence costs the U.S. over $5.8 billion annually. For example, imagine how many times a 911 call is placed for domestic violence. Then an officer must visit the residence to try to de-escalate the situation. If the officer is successful, a report is then filed. Once the officer leaves, the victim could either be grateful or maybe even fearful if the officer wasn't able to do more. But if the officer must remove someone from the home in handcuffs, this adds to the cost of domestic violence, paid for by the taxpayers, of course. It sounds like domestic violence is the expensive gift that keeps on giving. Did you know that part of those gifts goes to children? That's right. Kids that are exposed to any kind of violence are going to perform worse in school. They're not going to be as healthy, and they tend to repeat the behaviors that they witness. In other words, children who witness domestic violence are more likely to develop behavioral and emotional problems. They are 3 times more likely to grow up to repeat the cycle of abuse in their own relationships, creating a continuing societal burden. And then we have this image of the mother holding the child. But what is the child learning? He's learning, oh, so this is how I get my way. So how do we get domestic violence to stop? Well, here are 4 elements of persuasion. We've got emotional appeal, using visuals, social influence, and social proof. Emotional appeal is when personal stories from survivors of domestic violence can help someone who is lost and confused maybe feel a little bit less alone. Using visuals such as powerful images or videos showing the impacts of domestic violence and maybe positive outcomes of intervention can help victims, as well as allies feel inspired to get in there and help. Social influence is when we can see others advocating against domestic violence. It creates a sense of community and helps victims come forward and share their experiences. Social proof is when people look to others' actions and behaviors to guide their own, especially in uncertain situations. Some other ways that we can try to stop domestic violence is preventing it in the first place. And how do we do that? We get in there and start talking to the young kids, because these teenagers are going to become adults eventually. So we can either help them learn what domestic violence is so that they're aware on how to stop it and prevent it or walk away from it. And how do we do that? It's in 3 easy steps. Educate individuals to spark behavior change at the individual level. Raise awareness to spread knowledge and spark an attitude shift in society. Mobilize millions of young people proud to lead the conversation and spark change. This is how we end relationship abuse and create a world of healthier relationships. Some other ideas are educating boys and girls when they're young. Offer supportive conversations to high schoolers and church youth groups. Parents and teachers can get help with kids, especially if they notice emotional insecurity early on. I think the most important thing is to have open discussions about how our insecurities affect our relationships. Whether we are insecure and don't speak up for ourselves and get out of an abusive relationship, or if we are so insecure that we try to control others. I believe that addressing the insecurity as young as possible will help adult relationships be much more healthier in the future. Many great nonprofit companies like One Love have developed and started implementing programs that teach our teenagers about what healthy relationships look like. And finally, if you or someone you know is in a domestic violent relationship, please call the phone number on your screen. Some tips on how to leave an abusive relationship is: number 1, build a support team. This is the most important thing you can do, because you've been isolated for so long. That's going to be difficult, but you need people behind you so that you have someone to talk you through this. It's also important that you keep a journal of all of your emotions, especially the bad days. When you decide to leave, stay firm with your decision to leave. Maybe mark a date on the calendar. That way you know what date you are committed to. The next step I would recommend is to find a place that is safe for you to stay. Once you've actually left, cut off contact. Delete his phone number from your phone, unfollow them on social media, whatever you have to do to resist yourself from going back to what you are used to. As often as you can, remind yourself that you deserve better. Write it on your mirror. Put a reminder on your phone that goes off every day to remind you that you deserve better. Do whatever it is you can to stick with your decision. Express your feelings, whether it's talking to a therapist or a friend or journaling some more. You need to express those feelings. It's going to be confusing and it's going to be hard to reprogram your mind that you don't need him. My favorite advice is to do the things he never wanted you to do. When it gets hard, go back to your journal and remember why you left. And probably the most important of all of this is to surround yourself with positivity. You don't have to live with abuse, and you can get help. That is it for my social issue presentation. My name is Crystal Wells, and here are my references. Page 1, and here's my references, page 2, and here's my references, page 3. Thanks again, and have a great day.